Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents King Arthur's Wars by Jim Storr, narrated by Julian Alpha. Introduction to the Revised Edition. The introduction and general tone of the first edition of this book modestly underrepresented its contents. In practice, King Arthur's Wars does several things. It describes the rediscovery of a major series of earthworks, dozens of miles long, stretching across much of the English landscape. It catalogues and interprets those earthworks. It applies the study of English place names so as to allow a far better understanding of the geography of late and post-Roman England. It reappraises the history of the transition from late Roman Britain to Anglo-Saxon England. It proposes the first truly geographically coherent account of that process. It makes a major reappraisal of our understanding of warfare in the period. The evidence suggests that warfare was far more sophisticated in some aspects than we have generally believed. It provides some explanation as to how and why previous analyses have been mistaken. If its broad findings are correct, it requires every single book written about the period to be reassessed. Not least, the geographical context of those works can be seen to be flawed. By every single, that includes translations of primary sources such as Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People. The revised edition adds a small amount of new material, some revisions and some minor corrections. It does not alter the broad findings of the original work. Introduction to the first edition. How did Roman Britain become Anglo-Saxon England? The answer matters. This book is written in English, not Scots Gaelic nor Latin. Before the Anglo-Saxon Conquest, there was no English. Anglo-Saxons gave the world the English language, the language of Shakespeare, Keats, Byron and Shelley, parliaments, trial by jury and, perhaps unfortunately, cricket and warm beer. Every time you get into a passenger aircraft anywhere in the world, the air traffic controllers will be speaking English. So it does matter. It's not just about rewriting a chapter of the history of England, it's about how the English became the English and, to that extent, much about the modern world. We do not, however, really know the answer. There are very few historical sources from the period. There are also a few intriguing but garbled and confused oral sources which were written down centuries later. The archaeology of the period is scant, confusing, and at times contradictory. What we understand of the period today is a mosaic of facts, half-truths, and myths. Some of the biggest myths are surprisingly recent. There is not really any one single, coherent account. What little we do know shows huge gaps and some surprising inconsistencies. King Arthur's Wars attempts to shed light on that simple question. How did Roman Britain become Anglo-Saxon England? The book takes what we know of archaeology and history and adds a few more ingredients. They generally relate to the landscape. What did it look like at the time? What can that tell us? One ingredient is an aspect of place name study, asking what the name of a place can tell us about what it looked like in historic times. Another ingredient is an extensive and thorough look at the terrain and the landscape today. That has involved weeks of map study, months of personal reconnaissance, and employing a soldier's eye for ground. Soldiers are trained to look for things which other people are not. They may see things which archaeologists and historians, for example, have not. In addition, just having a fresh pair of eyes looking at a problem may reveal things that others have missed. In this case, it most certainly has. There is an elephant in the room. What the elephant is will be revealed as the story develops. In addition, it seems that King Arthur was the stuff of medieval legend. The legend was probably based on a real late Roman army commander. His wife, Guinevere, was quite possibly blonde and may have come from Shropshire. And yes, I think I know where Camelot is. Memorial, on the banks of the Tamar. He stood on a hill overlooking the river. He was Egbert, son of Egfrid, son of Ethelwald, earldom of Wessex. The river was the Tamar. Across the river was Cornwall, the last refuge of the British. Ethelwald, his father's father, had marched north with the King of Wessex to fight the Mercians at the great battle of Ellendon. His father's 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 father had been with the king when they marched into Winchester, and he was there when the next king was crowned. His father had fought at the Broad Ford when the men of the West Saxons had beaten the Welsh and gone on to conquer the shires of Wiltshire, Dorset, Somerset, and finally Devon. It is said that his father had been there when the holy Birinus first preached to the West Saxons and thus brought the love of Christ to the companions. They were Saxons, they were West Saxons, but before St. Birinus they had just called themselves the Companions. His father had fought with the mighty Ceolwyn at Bedconford, and when they seized the towns of Limebury, Aylesbury, Benson, and Aynsham. And it is said that his father's father's father was one of the few to escape from the massacre at Badon, when the accursed Arthur had brought his cavalry down from the north and slain hundreds of the North folk and the South folk. Never again did the men of Norfolk and Suffolk rise against the British. All those kinsmen had lived in Britain for many years, but it is said that his father's father's father had sworn an oath under a German chieftain to fight for the Romans in Colonia Augusta on the mighty River Rhine in Germany. He was Egbert, son of Egfrith, son of Ethelwald, earldom of Wessex. From him to that day in Cologne were 15 sons and fathers. It is said that one day his king, Alfred of Wessex, would be king of all England, or perhaps his son, or his son's son, and Egbert was proud, for was he not himself a true Saxon? 1. King Arthur's Wars. By the late 4th century, England and Wales had been part of the Roman Empire for about 350 years. Roman Britain had many towns and about 30 cities connected by an extensive and well-built road network. Most of the population spoke a Celtic language, but some spoke and wrote in Latin. Society was organized, government functioned, and trade was conducted using Roman law. England, Wales, and much of both Scotland and Ireland were part of a continent-wide trade system. Goods from places as far away as Turkey and Egypt were traded for tin, corn, and other cargoes from Britain. By the mid-9th century, Britain was very different. Most of the people in what had become England spoke an entirely different language. Roman law had disappeared. It had been replaced by a rapidly developing system based on Germanic tribal custom. The towns and cities had been largely abandoned, but were slowly being redeveloped. In simple terms, in the year 400 AD, most people thought of themselves as Roman citizens. By 850, they did not. Those changes had been accompanied by a major series of wars. They were fought between the descendants of the Romano-British inhabitants and people who were, or were descended from, Germanic invaders. We now call those people Anglo-Saxons, and we know that, broadly, they won. However, that was by no means inevitable. For more than a century it seemed unlikely. We know very little about those wars. The change from Roman Britain to Anglo-Saxon England was not just a matter of warfare. There was major social, political, economic, and cultural change as well. But war was a major factor. War can and has changed the fate of continents, and do so astonishingly quickly. War was hugely important in this period. It was a period of much violence, brutality, and main force. The wars by which Roman Britain became Anglo-Saxon England are the main subject of this book. If there was someone called Arthur, someone who we now know as King Arthur, what role did he play? It does seem that he and others like him were key figures in those wars. That is why we shall call those conflicts King Arthur's Wars. But no matter what role he played, no one man could be responsible for the course and outcome of a series of wars which stretched over 450 years. The English have forgotten. They remember the Norman Conquest. There were only about 7,000 Norman invaders, perhaps as many as 10,000. With their families and retainers, the total may have been 20 to 30,000 people. They took over England in roughly 20 years. They had a major impact on society. Within a generation, over 70% of all men had names of French origin: Roberts, Williams, Hughes, Johns, and so on. Arguably, however, the Normans had little impact on the law or the language. Today, the English speak English, not Norman French. The Normans made several laws, but did not change the underlying basis of the law. The Anglo-Saxon Conquest, if conquest it was, took far longer, about 450 years. 450 years from the Norman Conquest would take England into the reign of Henry VIII, arguably England's first post-medieval king. The English are unlike many other Europeans. They do not, like most of Western Europe, have a Roman law code. A law code is the basis for the way society is run, government is conducted, and trade takes place. Laws and legal systems are written statements of observed and enforceable social, political, and economic norms. So the fundamental basis for the way in which England is run is very different from that of much of Europe. That difference has had major implications, for example, in Britain's relationship with the European Union. Roman law triumphed elsewhere for several reasons. Most of them did not apply in a society which, like post-Roman Britain, had largely collapsed. Britain is the only major region of the former Western Roman Empire which did not develop a Latin-based language. England is different. The Germanic takeover of England took centuries and had a major impact. The use of a Germanic language, which is closer to Frisian Dutch than any other similar language, suggests that Roman structures of law and society largely disappeared. They were rebuilt by Germanic incomers and their successors. The difference is important. Without the Germanic takeover, Britain might still be called Britain as it was in Roman times. But England would not be the land of the English. The English language would probably not exist. The United States, the Commonwealth, and several other countries would not exist as they do now. Many million people around the world would not speak English. America might be the land of the free, but its constitution would be very, very different. Terminology is highly important in this area. Terms like Dark Age, Celtic, Anglo-Saxon, and British are often used loosely. That can be a problem. In this book, they will have fairly specific meanings. Britain will be taken to mean the whole of the British Isles, whilst Roman Britain will mean that part of Britain which the Romans conquered. Put simply, that means England south of Hadrian's Wall, thus excluding much of Northumberland and Wales. Southern Scotland was an important part of the Roman imperial system and will be discussed later. The question of what Celtic means is important. Here it is used very narrowly to describe culture and language. Before the Roman conquests, much of Western Europe had something broadly described as Celtic culture and spoke Celtic languages. So when we refer to Celtic in Britain, we mean the language and culture that underlay Latin and Roman culture. By extension, Romano-British is a general term to describe the largely Celtic-speaking people who lived in Britain at the end of imperial Roman rule. They didn't go away or disappear. By and large, they were conquered or taken over by what we now call the Anglo-Saxons. The origins of the Anglo-Saxons were Germanic. Many of the original invaders came from what is now North Germany, the Netherlands, especially Frisia, or Denmark. They are described in historical sources as Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. By the 10th century or so, the term Anglo-Saxon had been coined to differentiate their successors from the Romano-British. By then, however, almost none of the Anglo-Saxons had ever been to Germany. Their ancestors had lived in England for centuries. Saxon requires very careful consideration. The Romans used it fairly loosely in the way that we might now say German or perhaps Germanic. Many people who we now think of as having Saxon origins, such as the people of Wessex, never use the term to refer to themselves. To reduce ambiguity, we will use Saxon in one of two specific ways. The first and least important is to refer to people who come from the region of North Germany around Hanover, Saxony. The second is to refer to the people of what became the kingdoms of the East, South, and West Saxons, Essex, Sussex, and Wessex respectively. Welsh requires even more careful use. The word is derived from a Germanic word for foreigner. The word has developed to describe several peoples who lived beyond the borders of where Germanic people lived. Hence Wallis, the German name for the French-speaking canton of Valais in Switzerland, Wallachia in Romania, the principality beyond Transylvania, where many Germanic people had settled, and Wales. Unfortunately for us, the Anglo-Saxons called the Romano-British foreigners, hence Welsh. That leads to confusion because, for example, a Germanic warrior in Kent in the 5th century, who was by origin possibly a Jute from Jutland, might call the Romano-British inhabitants of London or Surrey Welsh. To avoid that confusion, we shall call those people Romano-British and keep the word Welsh for the inhabitants of Wales. They are, after all, inhabitants of what we now call Wales. They are descended from the Romano-British and still what the Anglo-Saxons would have called foreigners, hence to that extent Welsh. Modern Wales is essentially the part of Roman Britain which the Anglo-Saxons never conquered. The inhabitants of Ireland had a Celtic culture and language, as did most of Scotland. Some confusion arose in the past because there are broadly two main forms of Celtic language in Britain. They are known as P and Q Celtic, or alternatively, Brythonic and Gaelic. The boundary of where those languages were spoken was not well understood, and there was some movement of tribes. Hence, confusingly, a tribe called the Scotti were considered to be Irish. We shall use the term Irish only to refer to people who lived in Ireland, and Scottish to refer to people who lived in modern Scotland. The term Picts or Pictish will be taken to mean Scots who lived north of the River Forth, where the Romans never settled. The Romans used the term Picti, the painted ones, to describe them from about 300 or 310 AD. The modern Welsh word for Wales is Cymru, which is derived from the Romano-British word for companions. The late Romano-British used it to describe themselves as opposed to the Anglo-Saxons. One form of it was Cumbrogis, hence Cumbria as a region of the Romano-British. Cumbria was one of the last areas to become Anglo-Saxon. The Romano-British called themselves Britones, hence British, when they wrote in Latin, which they continued to do until after the Norman Conquest. Thus, when a Welshman today says he is British, he is absolutely correct. When were the Dark Ages? The term is used loosely and can mean different things to different people. There is very little, if any, historical record between the end of Imperial Roman Britain and, for example, the writings of the Venerable Bede. The period in between is dark to the extent that little or no historical record illuminates it. We will use the term Dark Ages to mean the period from about 400 to about 730 AD. Historians tend to use the term Early Medieval, but that can include the period up to the Norman Conquest. The broad sequence of King Arthur's wars is quite simple, although the dates are vague, for reasons which we will discuss later. Imperial rule in Britain seems to have ended soon after 400 AD. Some Germanic people were already settled in Britain by then. Increasing numbers arrived in the 5th century, often as warriors to protect the east coast and to some extent to replace Roman forces. In the middle of that century, about 450, some of them rebelled. The rebellion was contained, and by about 500 they were contained in small pockets in what we now call East Anglia, Essex, Kent and Sussex. Strictly, East Anglia is the land of the East Anglians. It was divided between the land of the North folk and the South folk, hence Norfolk and Suffolk. It does not include the land of the East Saxons, namely Essex. There were probably also groups of Germanic settlers in Lindsey, the area around Lincoln, East Yorkshire, Northumberland, and some other smaller pockets. That situation lasted for about 50 years. Then, in the middle of the 6th century, separate groups began to fight the Romano-British again and conquer further territory. The Kingdom of Wessex developed from about 550 AD. Germanic kingdoms developed in Essex, East Anglia, the Midlands, Yorkshire and Northumberland from about 570 AD. By no means all of the fighting was against the Romano-British. The Yorkshire and Northumberland kingdoms fought each other until one man ruled both as the King of Northumbria. Mercia, the Midland Kingdom, fought against Northumbria and Wessex for centuries. At times, any or all of them were allied to Romano-British kingdoms whose names are often wrapped in mystery. By about 850 AD, Northumbria, Mercia and Wessex had conquered most of modern England, swallowing up the smaller kingdoms of Kent, Essex, Sussex and East Anglia on the way. It was a slow and fitful process. In some areas no progress was made against the Romano-British for a century or so. King Alfred, the only king in English history to be called the Great, ruled from 871 to 899 AD. He was a king of Wessex and never ruled England. Viking raids had started in 793. Alfred and his contemporaries spent far more time and effort fighting the Vikings than the remaining Romano-British. His son Edward the Elder united England under one throne, not least due to the Viking invasions. England was not free of Viking incursions until after the Norman Conquest of 1066. It can, however, reasonably be said that Alfred's descendants ruled a unified Anglo-Saxon kingdom. The advent of Alfred and the Vikings' incursions can be seen as the end of King Arthur's wars. There are many problems in trying to understand this period. There is almost no historical record and little archaeology. Both disciplines present problems when looking at the Dark Ages. History books tend to describe one of two views of the period, which we can call Edwardian and modernist. Edwardian writers tended to take works such as Bede's largely at face value. They believed that Britain was invaded by waves of Germanic invaders who felled the mighty oak forests, ploughed the land, rapidly disposed of the effete and decadent Romano-British, became Christian, and brought democracy and parliamentary government to England. That, of course, is a great simplification, but it exposes two things: the attitudes of the Edwardians and the relative absence of archaeological evidence in Edwardian times. According to the modernist view, there were no invasions, just migrations. The cultural shift from Romano-British to Anglo-Saxon was largely peaceful and cultural. Key archaeological issues, such as the fact that many of the Germanic migrants cremated their dead rather than burying them intact, are taken to reflect peaceful cultural transition rather than conquest. Men started to carry weapons in public as fashion statements to reflect a peace-loving society. The mighty forests were not hewn down, they did not exist, because Britain had been deforested in the Iron Age. That is also a parody, but each of its elements is taken from recent books on the Dark Ages. The great works on the subject tend to come from mid to late 20th century. They are the standard textbooks used at universities. They tend towards the Edwardian rather than the modernist view. The volumes of the Oxford University History of England are important amongst them. The first volume, originally written in 1936, was entitled Roman Britain and the English Settlements by R.G. Collingwood and J.N.L. Noel Myers. Myers wrote the piece most relevant to us, namely the final 5 chapters on post-Roman Britain. When the book was rewritten 50 years later, Myers rewrote his work as a separate volume simply called The English Settlements. He was then 84 years old, and it was a mistake to ask him to write it. His thinking had not moved on. The Roman part of the original book was rewritten in 1981 by Peter Solway. The succeeding volume, Anglo-Saxon England, was written by Sir Frank Stenton in 1943. There is no good, modern, standard reference book which covers our period in general and the wars between the Romano-British and the Anglo-Saxons in detail. That causes several problems. For example, there may have been a major incursion against Britain by Picts, Saxons and others in or about the year 367 AD. As a result, several archaeologists in the early 20th century dated sites or finds to 367. Some recent writers took that at face value. Indeed, much early dating is now considered to be wrong, but there is no way to get writers who only read the Oxford history to understand what is now thought to be right. A related problem is that Bede, who is almost the only and certainly the most reliable writer who lived close to the period, only dated 9 events relevant to our subject in a period of several centuries. So there is little or no chronological backbone on which to hang events. The 5th and 6th centuries are a critical period in which Bede provides no useful dates at all. The Edwardian approach tends to largely overlook the Romano-British, not least because Bede did. It also tends to dwell extensively on the advent of Christianity among the Anglo-Saxons. Well, the Anglo-Saxons may have adopted Christianity much as Bede described it. After all, he was a monk and became a saint. However, the Romano-British were already extensively Christianized. They had churches and bishops long before the end of Imperial Roman Britain, and they survived long after. Older historians have tended to cling to the notion of a conquest and a large migration of Germanic warriors. Newer generations, and particularly archaeologists, increasingly reject that view. Some of them are definitely in the modernist camp. The reason is fairly easy to see. History tends to be written by the winners and from the top down. It looks at kings and the view from the throne. Conversely, archaeology tends to look from the bottom up. It often looks at things like huts, farming, and cooking implements. The archaeology shows little direct sign of wars. The two views can be reconciled, but for this period that has not yet happened. A further problem is that of place names. The names of the locations of events such as battles are known to us from works such as Bede's or the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Early historians made educated guesses as to where those places were. They then joined those places together to form a picture of how wars took place. Unfortunately, the locations are often flawed. They are perhaps wrong, not credible, or lead to seriously misleading conclusions. Unfortunately, many writers do not check the original texts against what we now know of the origins of place names. As a result, some fairly major myths exist and will persist unless corrected. A further tendency is to wrap a few place names up with a fairly superficial understanding of warfare. The result is a simplistic view of the strategy of the wars of the Dark Ages. The two main ways of shining light into the Dark Ages are through history and archaeology. Since the early 20th century, history has been increasingly concerned with the study of documents and other recorded material. To that extent, it is not the study of the past, but insight into what happened in the past based on what has been written and what we can say about that. Some people believe that history can tell us what actually happened. That, however, is impossible. The historian cannot do more than collect, assess, and interpret evidence. He should then come to some opinion or judgment. That point is critical. In a criminal trial, the jury must believe that the evidence is convincing beyond all reasonable doubt. In a civil trial, however, the evidence is only required to be more likely than unlikely. For the Dark Ages, we cannot be certain beyond all reasonable doubt. For this book, we shall normally make judgments based on evidence that we think is more likely than unlikely. The original historical sources and most modern history books have great gaps in them. For example, we know that soon after the Roman invasion, the Iceni revolted in about 61 AD. We know that the Iceni were a tribe based in what is now East Anglia. We also know that by 500 or so, East Anglia was extensively settled by Anglians. Angle, where they came from, is a region of Denmark. How did that happen? What happened to the Iceni? When did it happen? We simply do not know. That is a major gap in our knowledge. There are many others. Most of the original historical source documents we know of are made up of half-truths. They were sometimes collected from lost original texts or distorted by the interests or ignorance of their authors. The only contemporary source written in England is Gildas's The Ruin of Britain. We don't really know who Gildas was, when or where he was writing, what his occupation was, nor when the events he described took place. He probably wrote in about 540 AD, and he was not writing a history. His main purpose was a religious tirade against the unchristian behavior of the rulers of post-Roman Britain. Reading his work today, he comes across as a religious fanatic. He tells us a fair amount about the life and social attitudes of the times, but relatively little about what took place. Even though we believe he wrote in the 6th century, the earliest copy we have is from the 10th. Two other copies are from the 12th and 13th centuries. They all show some evidence of amendment from the presumed original. The next source, in terms of date, is the Historia Brittonum, or History of the British. It is often referred to by the name of its supposed author, Nennius. One version contains a version of the Annales Cambriae, or Welsh Annals. There are many problems with the use of these works as historic sources. The medieval and Celtic expert Professor David Dumville strongly criticised any reliance on Nennius and similar Welsh sources, not least because they were written down about 250 to 300 years after the events to which they relate. In the interim, a lot of the material was probably changed by being passed down verbally. The Historia Brittonum has very little detail in the 6th century after the events of Arthur, who probably died in about 530 AD or so. It is of little use as a historical document. If it is not reliable, then there is no way of validating the events described in Welsh legendary poems such as the Book of Taliesin and the Book of Aneurin. Such sources are a good example of what happened when medieval authors tried to marry legendary, narrative material with a dated record. So apart from Gildas, there is no contemporary British written source from before the 9th century, and later sources are unreliable. Professor Dumville's remarks, published in the highly respected journal History, also had the effect of discouraging respectable academic historians from looking specifically at the age of Arthur, say 400 to 550 AD. There had been two quite good books in the 1970s, but nothing of that quality since. The much venerated Bede wrote his History of the English Church and People in the early 730s AD. Bede was a monk at the monastery at Jarrow. He enjoyed the patronage of the King of Northumbria. He was not British, he was an Anglo-Saxon, which strongly affected what he wrote. Bede paraphrased Gildas for the critical early chapters of his book, which has two main effects. Firstly, it tells us nothing useful about the period up to 550 AD or so, which is not mentioned in Gildas. Secondly, several modern writers do not realize that and have drawn false conclusions. For example, it has been suggested that Bede corroborates Gildas. He doesn't. He repeats Gildas. Bede's story of the arrival of the Germans in Britain was not his, written 300 years after the event, and does not actually describe a mass migration as Edwardian historians tended to assume. His story of the two Germanic leaders, Hengest and Horsa, is almost definitely legendary. The two names mean something like stallion and mare respectively. A Germanic warrior quite possibly had the nickname of the stallion.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?